Good morning, everyone. Welcome back, I'm sure, to many of you. As usual, Nikki Clements and I would like to thank first and foremost the Department of Religion at Rice for sponsoring the wonderful conference that we have been hosting and that has been unfolding before many of your eyes for the past 3 weeks. We'd also like to thank the Rockwell Foundation for substantial financial support and also the Rice Humanities Research Center for its additional support. As I said, the conference is titled Foucault's Confessions. We've been focusing on Foucault's engagement with Christianity, largely Catholicism, although not entirely. We've visited Foucault the person in several of our previous talks. Foucault the poet, Foucault the researcher, Foucault the undefinable, sublime figure in the cosmos, and are going to continue in broadly venturesome spirits, and also in the interdisciplinary spirit that Nikki was so sensitive to in putting together and inviting and putting together the speakers in that we've had so far and that we will have to come. I should mention that now we have several, perhaps all of the past talks, with the exception of Philippe Chevalier's, available for you online. And we're planning, of course, to continue to upload the recordings of the speakers who are willing to have themselves recorded through the end of the conference. So we are, if my count is correct, now at our 9th presentation in the series of talks. Very pleased to have with us Danielle Lorenzini, whom I will allow Nikki to introduce appropriately. Thank you again all for attending.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you to all of our listeners and viewers from around the world. It's a real delight to welcome you to the 9th session of Foucault's Confessions, our virtual series that started with Jim Bernauer and Peter Brown in week 1. We moved to the wonderful articulations of Lynn Huffer and Elizabeth Clark, alongside that of Philippe Chevalier and Mark Jordan. And today we have Danielle Lorenzini after Tuesday's wonderful presentation with Arianna Squarzini. And next week we have, concluding our series, Martina Tazzioli, and then on Thursday, Ashim Membe, and our own Jim Fabian giving us concluding remarks. So it's really an extraordinary set of individuals coming from a range of disciplines, as well as from a range of spots around the world. And I think this is very much in the style of the kind of Foucauldian expedition we're all on. We're trying to figure out not only what is this iconic individual teasing out in the archives, in his work over his last decade, that allows us to think that Confessions of the Flesh is complete, but also to take apart that entire narrative in order to see just how many folds there really are, disciplinarily, textually, conceptually. And I'm so pleased that we'll be able to hear from Daniele Lorenzini today, because he does not only the textual unfolding in the archives, but he also allows us to think through this textual unfolding through a very specific kind of conceptual perspective, a conceptual perspective of critique, one that really looks at the forms of resistance within Foucault, not as a turn to a neoliberal individualism, but instead as an act of critical resistance. So we're really thinking about this as an intellectual imperative. How do we think about the ethical, political, social ramifications of what Foucault's work can allow us to think through today? Also, because these are the concerns that were his own, as he showed not only in his activism, but also in his work. So today we have Professor Daniele Lorenzini, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick, where he also co-chairs the Center for Research in Post-Kantian European Philosophy. He's published widely in the fields of 20th century French philosophy, ordinary language philosophy, ethics, and political philosophy. And his two monographs are La force tirée de Foucault à Austin and Éthique et politique de soi, Foucault, Hadot, Cavell, and La technique de l'ordinaire. He's also the co-editor of Foucault Studies and is the co-editor of two book series, the Philosophie du présent by Vrin and the Chicago Foucault Project. Two of these works are the very vital Discours et Vérité, the collection of lectures that Foucault gives in 1983, and also Dire vrai sur soi-même, the conferences that Foucault gives in Toronto, the latter of which has just come out in an English edition that Daniel Weisch had presented through the Chicago series. So we're indebted to the work that you've done, bringing these interviews into the publication list of Foucault, and also for allowing us to think with you today on these questions of conceptual importance. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Daniele Lorenzini.
Thank you so much. Many thanks, Nikki and Jim, for this introduction, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful series of talks that you put together. Learned so much from the other speakers so far. So I really look forward to the discussion today and to what is still to come. So when choosing what to talk about today, I kind of hesitated between two options. On the one hand, a more historical or philological approach focused on the work I'm doing for the edition of a bunch of unpublished materials that reflect, I think, two different stages in the evolution of Foucault's project of the history of sexuality. A first stage, I would call this the 1975 stage, the earliest stage of the project, we could say, at least if you don't consider as straightforwardly part of the project, Foucault's lectures on sexuality from the 60s, a stage that we already in part know thanks to Les Anormaux and La volonté de savoir. On May 8th, 1975, right after the Collège de France lectures, Foucault gives a talk directly on discourse and repression, where he offers a critical analysis of the notion of sexual repression and the repressive hypothesis. He gives the same talk, only the concluding paragraphs are slightly different, the same year on November 14th at Columbia University under the title, We Are Not Repressed. And right before that, in October 1975, Foucault visits Brazil to give a series of lectures at the University of Sao Paulo on the genealogy of modern knowledge about sexuality. Foucault there originally planned to give 8 lectures, but ended up only giving 4 as he decided to interrupt the lecture course in solidarity with the student protest movement over the imprisonment of students and professors by the military regime. So the edition that I'm currently preparing with Henri-Paul Fouchot and Arnold Davidson will include these materials from 1975, when Foucault's history of sexuality is still limited chronologically, the period spanning from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, and motivated philosophically and politically by a critique of the notion of sexual repression. But that's not all, because the volume will also include materials from a second stage in the evolution of Foucault's project of the history of sexuality, the 1980s stage. I will say a crucial moment in my opinion, and I'll say more about this in a while. In October and November 1980, at the New York Institute for the Humanities, Foucault leads with Richard Sennett a seminar on sexuality and solitude, followed by a public lecture on the same topic. What is remarkable and funny in a way about this seminar is that we can see a complete inversion of roles there. It's now Sennett who focuses on the modern knowledge about sexuality, especially on medical knowledge about masturbation in the 18th and 19th century, whereas Foucault shifts his attention to early Christianity, the framework of his analysis, is already that of Les Aveux de la chair. More precisely, Foucault offers here an analysis of the relationships between virginity, chastity, and married life in the writings of the Church Fathers, preceded by a brief analysis of what he calls the elephant pattern, so Francis of Sales, and of Artemidorus' interpretation of dreams, aimed at showing that the partage, the difference between pagan and Christian authors as regards sexuality, is not to be conceived of in terms of a difference in moral codes, but in terms of a difference in the ethical relationship to oneself, a difference in modes of subjectivation. So the volume will also include these materials from 1980, and I think it will allow you to perceive more clearly this important shift in Foucault's history of sexuality. A chronological shift on the one hand, with a new focus on early Christianity and the indication already that Foucault wanted to go back in time even more to Greco-Roman antiquity, and the full emergence really of his interest in ethics, defined as the relationship of self to self and in the techniques of the self, is, I think, to be situated precisely here as a response to a methodological need and to the question, how can we account for the difference between pagan antiquity and Christianity as regards sexuality? Not by looking at moral codes, Foucault claims, but by looking at modes of subjectivation. And his interest in ethics defined in this way, I think, fully emerges at this moment. So a chronological shift on the one hand, but also a shift in Foucault's overarching philosophical and political motivation, I think, for writing a history of sexuality in the first place. Foucault's problem in 1980 is no longer that of offering a critique of the notion of sexual repression, but that of problematizing the kind of subjects that we are, the form of subjectivity that was constituted by Christianity during the first centuries of our era, what Foucault also refers to as the subject of desire. Okay, so the first option for today was to talk about these materials in more detail, but I decided not to do that, both in a way to perhaps preserve the sense of discovery and surprise once the volume will be published, if everything goes well, in the first trimester of 2022. And because I thought that after all, it would be better in terms of discussion to talk about things that are more widely known. So in a way, that was just a teaser. And while I would be more than happy to respond to questions about the forthcoming volume during the Q&A, in the remainder of the talk, I will address a different question related to the shift that I was talking about. The question is the following: what does it mean to write a history of sexuality? What kind of history is Foucault's history of sexuality? And how do we make sense of the shift I've been referring to from a genealogy of modern knowledge about sexuality to a genealogy of the modern subject of sexuality or of desire? What does it mean, this shift from writing the history of sexuality focused on knowledge or knowledge power to writing a history of sexuality focused on the subject, right? So I've always found striking that the problem of the historical constitution of a specific form of subjectivity as the correlate of the emergence in the 19th century of a science of sexuality, what Foucault calls scientia sexualis, was not explicitly inscribed at the heart of Foucault's history of sexuality since its beginnings. As we all know, the main objective of La Volonté de Savoir is rather to describe the constitution and main features of the modern apparatus of sexuality, the modern dispositif de sexualité. The focus, in other words, is on the constitution of the modern medical and scientific discourse about sexuality and the mechanisms of power that it creates and that in turn supports it. In his lectures at Sao Paulo, Foucault similarly claims that his aim is to trace the genealogy of the science of sexuality by tracing the history of how sexual pleasure in the Christian West has been gradually subjected to a discourse of avowal, a discourse that Foucault defines in terms of a historically situated institutional practice connected to a whole network of power mechanisms. The political horizon of this genealogy is what Foucault calls the binarism, les binarismes, of oppression and silence. Foucault's genealogy of the modern science of sexuality aims to problematize the postulate that power works through the mechanism of repression, which forces people to silence, which also means that as long as we speak or can speak, we are in the process of conquering or exercising our freedom. At Sao Paulo, Foucault concludes, I quote Foucault, "I would not want people to believe that psychiatry, psychology, sexology, psychoanalysis, in short, all the now institutionalized instances of chattering, bavardage about sexuality, actually have a liberating value." So I would not want people to believe that these instances actually have a liberating value compared to what would have been up to our times a silent Puritanism. There has been no silent Puritanism of sexuality so far, Foucault goes on, and it is not because now we say it, it is not because now we go through it with all our discourses that we are free, end of quote. The shift that in the following years takes place in Foucault's work cannot therefore be reduced solely to a chronological change of focus. Starting from 1980, which, as I was saying, I consider as the crucial year in this story, Foucault's history of sexuality no longer focuses on the constitution of the modern apparatus of sexuality, or in other words, on the power knowledge mechanisms that address sexuality and sexual avowal, but, as Foucault writes in L'usage des plaisirs, on the forms of subjectivation and the practices of the self. More precisely, the problem of the formation of the science of sexuality is replaced by the question of how the modern individual could experience himself as a subject of a sexuality. A question that requires, Foucault argues, once again, a genealogy not of power knowledge mechanisms, though, but of the ways in which Western man had been brought to recognize himself as a subject of desire. That was a quote from L'usage des plaisirs. The second, third, and fourth volumes of Foucault's history of sexuality aim to retrace this genealogy. But what is a genealogy? Well, provisionally, then I will complicate this account and relying on Foucault's own words from his paper on Nietzsche genealogy history, we can define genealogy as an investigation that looks to beginnings, not in order to capture the essence of things or to search for some immobile form that has developed throughout history, but to retrace the accidental, contingent, and unexpected constitution and the historical transformations of an experience that still matters for us today. An experience that we mistakenly tend to consider as natural, as universal, as unchangeable. Foucault's history of sexuality in both of the stages that I mentioned, of course, this is a simplification. There are more than two stages, as Philippe showed 2 weeks ago. But say, at least in these two stages on which I want to focus today, the history of sexuality is not a history traditionally understood, but a genealogy that therefore possesses an ethical, social, political relevance that we should never overlook. Now, to make sense of the shift from a genealogy of the modern apparatus of sexuality to a genealogy of the subject of desire, I want to focus on Foucault's 1980 lecture course at the Collège de France, Du gouvernement des vivants, on the government of the living. Since its publication in 2012, this course has attracted quite a lot of attention, mostly due to the widespread acknowledgement of the pivotal role it plays in the evolution of Foucault's thought. Many scholars see in these lectures the beginning of the so-called final Foucault, as they contain the first fully developed elaboration of the third key dimension of Foucault's work, namely the dimension of subjectivity. There is, however, an important interpretive question that has so far passed virtually unnoticed. As Michel Foucault rightly observed when editing these lectures, Du Gouvernement des Vivants presents an extensive discussion of a series of early Christian authors, from Tertullian to Cassian, and of topics from baptism and canonical penance to self-examination and exhaustive avowal, which, as we now know, also constitute the backbone of Les Aveux de la chair. Yet, sexuality, or better, the emergence of the flesh in early Christianity, are absent from Du Gouvernement des Vivants, whose general framework is rather defined by the notion of the government of human beings through the manifestation of truth in the form of subjectivity. That is the expression that Foucault uses. In a paper that I published a few months ago in Foucault Studies, I argued that these two projects, the genealogy of the government of human beings by the truth and the genealogy of the subject of desire, albeit essentially linked to one another, of course, are conceptually autonomous, the former being clearly broader than the latter. Of course, they are strictly connected because both consist in exploring different ways in which the relations between subjectivity and truth have been structured in our society. However, it is the genealogy of the government of human beings by the truth that I think provides us with the key to understanding both Foucault's analysis of the care of the self and paresia in Greco-Roman antiquity, and the new shape his history of sexuality takes in the 80s. This is due to a twofold methodological shift that Foucault addresses at length in Du Gouvernement des Vivants. The shift from the notion of power to the notion of government, and the shift from the notion of knowledge, savoir, to the problem of truth. And I would like to take a few minutes to reconstruct these two shifts that seem to me are crucial. So on the one hand, Foucault, the philosopher of power, argues that in a way, he already shifted his attention from power to government at the end of the 70s, in Sécurité, Territoire, Population, and Naissance de la Biopolitique, where he redefined the notion of power in terms of government. Government understood, quote Foucault, in the broad sense of mechanisms and procedures intended to conduct human beings, to direct their conduct, to conduct their conduct, end of quote. This notion of government allows Foucault to respond to a well-known objection. In the first volume of his History of Sexuality, Foucault claimed that where there is power, there is resistance, and yet, or rather consequently, this resistance is never in a position of exteriority in relation to power. If this is true, however, so the objection goes, is resistance not ultimately pointless insofar as we are always trapped in a net of power relations? It is precisely in order to answer this objection that in his lecture course from 1978, Sécurité, Territoire, Population, Foucault elaborates the notions of government and of conduct, which in his view have a threefold meaning. First, one can conduct or govern someone else. Second, one can be conducted or governed by someone else. But third, one can also conduct or govern oneself. And the domain of ethics, as Foucault defines it, that is, as the elaboration of a certain relationship to oneself, is at least implicitly, if not fully, inaugurated in this moment. It will, I think, be fully inaugurated in 1980. 2 years later, in 1980, in his lectures at Dartmouth College, Foucault famously argues, I quote, "The contact point where the way individuals are driven by others is tied to the way they conduct themselves is what we can call government. Governing people in the broad meaning of the word is not a way to force people to do what the governor wants. It is always a versatile equilibrium with complementarity and conflicts between techniques which assure coercion and processes through which the self is constructed or modified by himself." End of quote. The analytic of power-knowledge relations developed in Discipline and Punish and the first volume of the History of Sexuality, among others, now appears to Foucault too narrowly focused on techniques of domination, as if government could be reduced to the operations of conducting the conduct of others. This, according to Foucault, risks suggesting that power is nothing but pure violence or strict coercion, whereas for Foucault, it consists in relations which involve a set of rational techniques whose efficiency is due to a subtle integration of coercion technologies and self technologies. Thus, the objection that Foucault was facing in 1976, how is resistance even possible if it is never an illusion of exteriority in relation to power, now appears misplaced. Foucault's notion of government encompasses both techniques of domination and techniques of the self, emphasizing their contact point and the specific ways in which techniques aimed at conducting others and techniques aimed at conducting oneself interact. The issue is therefore no longer, if you want, how to resist power, but how to be governed otherwise. That is, how to transform the interplay between and the respective strategic importance of techniques of coercion and techniques of the self in any given situation in order to counteract as much as possible the effects of domination. This shift from power to government, however, is not enough, Foucault says in 1980. In Du Gouvernement des Vivants, it claims that the shift has to be complemented with a second one, from the notion of knowledge, savoir, to the problem of truth. What does Foucault mean by that? Well, it's not immediately clear, but I think that Foucault wants to emphasize here that the procedures through which the truth is obtained and manifested in any given society, what he also calls a lethargy, are far more numerous and multifaceted than we usually think. What we call knowledge, he writes, connaissance, that is to say, the production of truth in the consciousness of individuals by logical experimental procedures, is only one of the possible forms of a lethargy, of the manifestation of the truth. Thus, it is clear that, as in the case of the shift from power to government, the shift from knowledge to truth is for Foucault a way to clarify and widen the scope of his previous analysis rather than to mark a radical break with them. The crucial methodological principle that he formulates in Du Gouvernement des Vivants, one that I think underpins all of his work in the 80s, is that human beings cannot be governed without carrying out operation in the domain of truth, and operations that are always in excess, Foucault says, of what is useful and necessary to govern in an effective way. Foucault's genealogy of the government of human beings relies on the postulate that no government, no hegemony is possible without a lethargy, that is, without a manifestation of truth that cannot be reduced to a series of rational or objective instances of knowledge. Now, within this transformed methodological context, no longer power knowledge, but government by the truth, the dimension of subjectivity is introduced by way of Foucault's claim that the form of government of human beings which has historically characterized our Western societies relies on a specific kind of a lethargy. the manifestation of truth in the form of subjectivity. Therefore, you see that it is as a consequence of the two aforementioned methodological shifts, and more specifically of the second one, that the theme of subjectivity takes central stage in the work of the final Foucault, and not vice versa. In the concluding remarks of the last lecture of Du Gouvernement des Vivants, Foucault claims that his analysis of the Christian practices of baptism, penance, and direction de conscience is actually a genealogy of techniques used in our society to establish a relationship between subjectivity and truth, i.e. to link the obligation of truth and subjectivity in increasingly complex and tight ways. In particular, the obligation to avow, the obligation to confess, to tell the truth about oneself, which defines Christian exagoreuses, constitutes an injunction that, according to Foucault, has never ceased to characterize our society as a whole. The central role that avowal plays in the history of our society is, of course, already a major theme of Foucault's work and of his history of sexuality in the 70s. In the 70s, however, Foucault's attention is still focused on the production of truth about oneself through confession as a means that allows for a certain kind of power to be exercised, as a tool used in order to control the subject and to make the subject more obedient. By contrast, the methodological and conceptual shifts that take place in Du Gouvernement des Vivants open up, I think, to Foucault the possibility of conceiving of a different kind of relation between truth-telling about oneself and the government of human beings, as his study of Greco-Roman care of the self and parousia clearly shows. Foucault's aim, I think, is now to draw an outline for a history of truth, and I quote Foucault from Du Gouvernement des Vivants, so to draw an outline for a history of truth from the point of view of acts of subjectivity or of the subject's relationship to himself, understood not only as a relationship of self-knowledge, but as a relationship of exercise of self on self, elaboration of self by self, transformation of self by self, that is to say, the relations between the truth and what we call spirituality, or again, truth act and ascesis through act and experience in the full and strong sense of the term. That is to say, experience as that which qualifies the subject, enlightens it about itself and about the world, and at the same time, transforms it. End of quote. So here, I think that in this quote from Du Gouvernement des Vivants, you really have basically all the themes that are going to occupy Foucault for the following 4 years, right? Through relationship of self to self, spirituality in the ancient sense of the term, ascesis, etc. So while the power knowledge framework only allowed Foucault to interpret the production of a true discourse about oneself, confession, if you want, as a coercive mechanism aiming to obtain obedience and submission, the new methodological framework he inaugurates in Du Gouvernement des Vivants allows him, I think, to emphasize that some practices of truth-telling and of truth-telling about oneself, far from producing subjection, can be interpreted as instances of the critical attitude, a notion that already in 1978, Foucault defines in relation to the 3 dimensions of truth, power, and the subject. As a consequence, what really emerges in Du Gouvernement des Vivants through the twofold methodological shift from knowledge to truth and from power to government is not simply the dimension of subjectivity in general, but a specific form of subjectivity. We always say the final Foucault is about subjectivity, but what is this subjectivity? I think that the specific form of subjectivity that Foucault is interested in his work of the 80s, is no longer defined just as the effect of the interplay between power mechanisms and knowledge procedures, as it was already in the 70s. I mean, Foucault was already interested in the subject as the effect of power knowledge mechanisms in the 70s. What emerges in the 80s is the notion of a subject that Foucault defines as the support and, in a way, as the battlefield that makes possible the operations of government by the truth in all of its dimensions. To govern someone else, to be governed by someone else, but also to govern oneself. We need, in a certain way, operations in the order of truth, also in order to govern oneself, ourselves. The subject that lies at the heart of the work of the final Foucault, from his analysis of early Christianity to his study of the Greek and Roman techniques of the self, is therefore what I suggest to call an alethurgic subject, of which the subject of desire constitutes a facet or an aspect. So let me conclude by going back to genealogy. In the literature on Foucauldian genealogy, one of the most common assumptions is that the latter can be, at best, preparatory, and is therefore constantly in need of being supplemented with a positive and perhaps a normative proposal. This assumption is shared by virtually all scholars who have been engaging with Foucauldian genealogy. Of course, it is formulated as an objection by those who are critical of Foucault. Think, for instance, of Nancy Fraser or Jürgen Habermas, who have argued that Foucauldian genealogy reduces knowledge to power, thus barring the possibility of founding social and political critique on stable normative grounds. But this idea that Foucauldian genealogy is at best preparatory and does not have any normative significance for social and political critique can also be found in authors who are sympathetic towards Foucault, such as Martin Sarr or Colin Koopman or Amy Allen. By revealing historically constituted objects to be historically contingent and therefore changeable, so the argument goes, Foucauldian genealogy renders our concepts and practices problematic and instills in us a sense for the non-necessary. But it is incapable of telling us how exactly we are supposed to take advantage of that. So quoting David Oy, genealogy recognizes that it does not change the world, but it does prepare the world for change. By disrupting the fatalism resulting from resignation to the inevitability of oppressive social institutions, genealogy frees us for social transformation, even if it does not tell us precisely what to do or where to go. So I think that this characterization of Foucauldian genealogy as merely preparatory is misleading. Since far from being purely debunking or problematizing, Foucault's genealogical inquiries and his history of sexuality as well have what I call a possibilizing dimension built into them. One that, albeit not normativistic, is, I think, normatively significant. My idea is that we must take seriously Foucault's claim that genealogy aims to, quote, separate out from the contingency that has made us what we are, the possibility of no longer being, doing, or thinking what we are, do, or think. This possibility, far from just being a logical one, is to be thought of in terms of the elaboration and practice of concrete ethico-political forms of counterconduct. And although genealogy does not legislate the specific content of the latter, it does, I think, define their form, since each of these conducts aim to criticize a given power knowledge apparatus, a given regime of truth that still govern certain aspects of our conduct today. More precisely, this possibilizing dimension is to be conceived of in terms of what I call a we-making process. My idea is that Foucauldian genealogy aims to reveal that the mechanisms that govern human beings' conduct and against which human beings fought in the past are still at play in the present. That's the point of a genealogy. You don't do a genealogy if the mechanisms that genealogy wants to reveal are not still at play, right? If you just do a history of something that is no longer at play today, then that's just a history. It's not a genealogy. So in a way, by recounting history that is still ours, albeit transformed, of course, a history that is not just a history of subjection, but also a history of contestation, of resistance, and of critique, Foucault's genealogy situates each of their readers within a multiplicity of we's that are created in the course of the genealogical narrative itself. Each of these communities, of these we's, carries with it, in an immanent fashion, a normative force that takes the form of a commitment, an ethical political commitment, pushing the readers to no longer submit to a given governmental apparatus, but to criticize and fight against its most dangerous effects. There is a force in the genealogy, or a force that the genealogy carries with it, and that aims to have an impact on its readers. So while it is undeniable that one of the main aims of Foucauldian genealogy is to make our past and present in a way alien to us, thus producing self-estrangement and perpetual resistance to unification, Foucauldian genealogy does not only produce individual desubjectivation, but also initiates processes of collective resubjectivation. It encourages, I think, the creation of a multiplicity of provisional and open-ended communities of resistance. That's a term of Jose Medina. So of communities of resistance, mutually intersecting and overlapping. This possibilizing dimension of Foucauldian genealogy, which has so far passed, I think, virtually unnoticed, becomes clear in Foucault's work starting from 1978. When the notions of counter-conduct and critical attitude are first coined, and the conceptual framework of governmentality is first elaborated. This opens up to Foucault the possibility of tracing genealogies that are no longer exclusively focused on power knowledge mechanisms, where the moments of resistance are constituted by, I would say, automatic and unreflective, irréfléchi reactions of the body. Think of the convulsive bodies that Foucault talks about in Les Anormaux and that Marc referred to in his talk. Think about the bodies of the hysterics, whose insurrection Foucault describes in Le Pouvoir Psychiatrique. From 1978 on, and even more clear from 1980 on, Foucault's genealogies put governmental mechanisms and the liturgic subject at their center, explicitly acknowledging the latter's capacity to govern herself differently. It is not a coincidence that in the 80s, Foucault refers several times to a genealogy of the critical attitude in our society, one in which resistance no longer takes the unreflective form of an automatic bodily reaction to power mechanisms, but the ethico-political form of a reflective practice of freedom. The 5 medieval counterconducts Foucault talks about in Sécurité territoire population are already, I think, a good example of this, but I also think that virginity in early Christianity is a great example. We already talked about it quite a lot during this series. So I'll be very brief. In Les Aveux de la chair, while retracing the genealogy of the subject of desire, Foucault refers to the angelism of virginity as a social phenomenon, which, as Peter Brown would say, undermined the existing sexual social contract. Foucault himself remarks that Gregory of Nyssa conceives of virginity not only as the individual liberation from sin, but also as a moment of transfiguration of the word, as a return to a heavenly condition, a return that entails a radical change of existence and described at the heart of a general history of the salvation of humankind. As Arianna showed in her talk, virginity is presented here as a positive and complex experience based on a personal choice capable of transforming the whole of one's life, as an element of a world without death and a principle of transfiguration directly pointing towards a new age of perfection for humanity as a whole. And according to Peter Brown, and I quote Peter Brown here, the debate about virginity in early Christianity was in large part a debate about the nature of human solidarity. By the 4th century, to upload virginity was to commit oneself by implication to a different image of the grounds of cohesion of society, a society that was then founded on marriage and procreation. In other words, Peter Brown says, to upload virginity meant to claim the right to dispose of one's own body as one pleased, to keep it out of circulation in society, thus resisting the force of social convention. And from this point of view, and going back to Lynn's talk, one could say that virginity was truly a form of social counterconduct, promoting a demystified or denaturalized vision of society. This is why the exponents of the angelism of virginity, while defending individual freedom to withhold one's own body from society, were also often committed to the ideal of the creation of alternative forms of social grouping. This is, I think, and that's my conclusion, one of the clearest possibilizing moments of Foucault's genealogy of the subject of desire in Les Aveux de la chair, one in which Foucault's genealogical inquiry reveals concrete practices of counterconduct, actual ways in which people started governing themselves differently, thus breaking the monotony of domination throughout history, as Walter Benjamin would have said. Foucauldian genealogy at its best thus relies on the claim, once again, and that's not a coincidence from Du Gouvernement des Vivants, that no power of whatever kind is obvious or inevitable, that no power has any intrinsic legitimacy. When Foucault is truly a genealogist, I dare say, as he dare say that about Nietzsche, his methodological standpoint is not descriptive, but predicated upon a critical attitude. Genealogy itself is predicated upon a critical attitude, one that is defined by the movement of freeing oneself from power, of wanting to be governed otherwise, an attitude that shares with anarchy the theoretical practical postulate of the non-acceptability of power and the constant questioning of all the ways in which power is in actual fact accepted. It remains true, however, that Foucault's genealogies can only push us in a certain direction while providing us with this kind of collective framework for our practices of resistance, and that it is still up to us to invent and to perform these practices of resistance, these new forms of counterconduct, these new ways of governing ourselves individually and collectively in the present. Back to work then. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniele. That was a really superb and very careful conceptual framing of these two stages, as you say, between 1975 and 1980, on the way in which Foucault as genealogist inhabits this critical attitude in ways that we need to take more seriously, not as something that's prescriptive, but instead something that is normatively significant insofar as it challenges us to take up this attitude ourselves. And so instead of imposing a prescription on ways of life, which is of course inimical to Foucault's own sensibility, we can take up a kind of ethos, maintain the presence to our own present, and then work critically as well as constructively moving forward. So I think it's a really beautiful set of reflections. I encourage people to submit their questions through the Q&A function, and we'll also be able to unmute you, hopefully, if you use the raise hand function. If it's all right, I'll just start with a concrete question that might not be answerable, but between the 1975 presentation and the 1980 presentation, I think that you're totally right in terms of these conceptually distinct projects that nevertheless kind of get both folded in, I think, in Les Aveux de la Chair. Like there are remnants of both. And so that's kind of the overarching suspicion that we've been working out, that we talked a bit about with Ariana the other day as well. And one of the forms of continuity that I really appreciate in these two moments is the way in which ethics as this relation of self to self is so important for Foucault, notably in 1980. And in the archives, in box 40 in the archives, the draft of the Howison lecture in French too, right, actually describes the kinds of technologies of the self in relation to technologies of domination, as well as technologies of production and signification that will be later talked about at Vermont very explicitly, but that are actually in draft form in the French draft from September 1980 in the archives. And so it seems like Foucault is already trying to very explicitly frame this question of how can we find a more robust way to think about not just technologies of domination, production and signification, but also these technologies of the self in a way that allows for any kind of ethical resistance internal to the operations of power and knowledge. So I say all that as prelude because the question is, how does parousia come into this all? In part because in that archive, right, in box 40, folder 1, Foucault, as he's describing this turn to the ethical, like the language he actually uses for the first time, as far as I've been able to tell, he also refers to parousia. He says parousia was the opening of the heart. He says, which he frames as a question of an ethical and technical rule concerning verbal relationships. So my question is like, where does parousia come from? And insofar as parousia for Foucault in 1984 ends up becoming that vector by which we can actually see the operations of the modes of erudition, the forms of governmentality, and the practices of the self interoperating at all times, it seems like parousia is like in his imaginary in a way that is just really striking. And I figure you would know better than almost anyone. So it's
absolutely. It's a huge question. Yeah. Let me try to just perhaps say a couple of things. So there would be, I think, a genealogy to be done of the way in which parousia kind of comes in as a concern for Foucault. And it is interesting, I think, that parousia is initially, I think, captures Foucault's interest just merely because it is a specific practice within la direction des consciences, both in the kind of ancient pagan sense and in the Christian sense. It seems to be, like one of these elements of continuity that Foucault is looking for at that moment. One of the things Foucault is looking for at that moment is precisely to show that there are a lot of continuities between the pagan words and the Christian words, right? In terms of both the ways in which we approach sexuality, in the way in which we also approach a certain kind of spiritual direction. Of course, the aim of the spiritual direction is entirely different, but the technology gets transmitted from the Stoics to the early Christians, right? And so I think that probably Foucault just stumbles on, like this term and this concept. And if you look at lecture courses in 1982 at the Collège de France, where parousia starts taking on a more important significance, it's still within that context. It's still within that kind of inversion that Foucault talks about. In ancient pagan times, it is the director who has to talk and the directee who has to listen. Whereas in Christian times, it is the pupil or, like the monk or the subject who has to confess, has to speak, and the directeur de conscience has to listen. And then you have this extraordinary way in which, starting from his lecture at the University of Grenoble in May 1982, poesy explodes in the hands of Foucault as, yes, this is one topic on which I want to write, on which I want to think in the next few years. And I think that has to do with a potential that Foucault discovers in poesia, a potential precisely of exploring the different forms of the government of human beings that I've been talking about. Poesia is both a way to govern the other by telling them the truth, is a way of governing, of letting oneself being governed by another by telling them your truth. But it's also a way, as he discovers, in particular with Socrates and with the Cynics, etc., a way of governing yourself and of kind of enacting that kind of counterconduct and that kind of resistance that Foucault is interested in. So it's such a fascinating I think it's such a fascinating concept for Foucault, because in a way that's precisely what he was looking for, something that allowed him to explore these three dimensions of government. So that would be a very imperfect way of responding to your wonderful question.
Oh, it's beautiful. And also the way in which resistance then is internal to the practice of enunciation instead of it merely being a practice of subjection. So one more strike against the Foucault's only form of resistance is solipsistic. Sorry, I'm just on this trip today. So I don't know if Jim, you'd like to chime in. We have some wonderful questions coming in. Actually, I'll start with one from Sandra Sperco, who says, "Thank you so much, Daniele. It was a fantastic conference. My question concerns the role of will in the course that you pointed out. Does the will suffer transformations that can be considered synchronical or parallel to Foucault's developments concerning subjectivities in the way you staked as certain forms of possible resistance since the gouvernement de vivant?"
Yes, so Sandra, very nice to have you there. Hi. It's a wonderful question, a very, very complicated one. So my first reading of Les Aveux de la chair, when it was still not a book, but it was still in the archives, was indeed focused on the notion of the will. And of the way in which, especially in the last part of Les Aveux de la chair, about Augustine, Foucault is tracing what I think is a sort of political history of the will. This idea of the splits in the subject that we already talked about in this series, that Augustine realizes by retelling the history of Adam and Eve in paradise, and this idea of a will that is split, that is no longer in control of itself, right? And therefore of what Augustine himself, I think, anticipating La Boétie, defines libera servitus. So like this free subjection, where the problem will be how to manage and how to govern this very peculiar subject whose will escapes from his own will. I mean, who is no longer able to have his own will under control. And the whole problem of the government of power, of resistance, I think is very interestingly redefined there. An application of this to more contemporary themes. I would have loved, to hear Foucault a bit more on this topic as applied to more contemporary themes. But you're right that from what is critique, where the will has such an important role, the will not to be governed like this, the way in which Foucault defines critique, to the will split in Augustine at the end, of Les Aveux de la chair. I think that you do have a very interesting evolution in which the will is one of the protagonists and perhaps never explicitly thematized by Foucault as such, which is a bit frustrating in a way. But I think that there's a lot of work to do on this notion of the will. I'm not able to do this on the spot, but I think it's a wonderful question and a wonderful topic for research.
I'm going to unmute Prasenjit Viswas. Apologies.
Yes. Yeah, Nikki, if I can speak, I'm asking a question to Danielle from India. And the question is the possibility of production of the subject, the self-production or the self-reproduction of the subject. And the act of reproduction is different from the act of production, because reproduction is not just a constitution, but it goes through a transitory state of becoming the other, the supplement, if I use the Derridian notion or Rousseau's notion of supplement. So there is this tension between the reproducing attitudes of the self and the continuous construction of a supplement around the self. And this causes a certain kind of a rupture in imagination of a we, or even the multiplicity of we that a reproducing self can will to imagine, but that imagination never comes to fruition. So this gives rise to a certain kind of a broken discourse or a broken sense of being, which is in terms of becoming another or the other subject without a subjectivity, or which is not still subjected to a process of subjection. Now this should be understood in terms of its relation to a certain truth about the technique of the self or the confession of the self that the self can make in the process of becoming the other. How are we going to reconcile this within a supposedly unified and singular framework of confession or construction of a subject that you have espoused so well? This comes as the primary question to me. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Once again, a lot to unpack here. Let me say that one of the main tensions that I see in the work of the late Foucault, of the final Foucault, is the tension between what one could call, processes of desubjectivation. So processes through which Foucault refers to, for instance, taking drugs as a process of desubjectivation, in which the self and experience of the self is shattered, right? And in which the aim of the processes of desubjectivation is precisely to render impossible for the subject to find the kind of unity or the kind of stable grounds that we usually find in, identity or in certain stable things that are around us, right? So you have this path of desubjectivation that Foucault explores. It talks about drugs, it talks about suicide, it talks about a certain experience of S&M in San Francisco. And then you have the other path that he talks about when he talks about the techniques of the self, in which the becoming other is, in a way, is a process of subjectivation, in which you have a certain stability in the form of the subject. I mean, the techniques of the self that you find in the Stoics, in the Epicureans, etc., have a defined form or ideal of what the subject should become at the end of that, right? Or of a certain stability of the subject. And of course, it has always been to me a kind of puzzling, right? The ways in which we can make sense of both strategies as potential strategies of resistance. I think that one way out, or one way to respond to your question, is it is always for Foucault a matter of what are we trying to resist? What are we opposing, right? So in certain instances, a certain practice of resistance that has a very specific unitary subject in mind as the aim could still play the role of counter-conduct. In other circumstances, you might want to go like through an experience that shatters your subjectivity a little more, or in ways that were not considered by the ancients. So that's a question for me as well. I wouldn't say that Foucault just espouses a singular unitary definition of what the subject should become, or what the subject should become as the other of itself. I think that Foucault tries to offer us a tactic or a strategic way of thinking of what do we do with our subjectivity.
Beautiful, thank you. Lynn Huffer, you are unmuted, so please ask your question out loud.
Thank you so much for your talk. Yeah, my question is also about subjectivity. And I guess it has to do with that question of desubjectivation, which to me characterizes all of Foucault's work right up to the end of his life. In L'usage du plaisir, he talks about s'égarer de soi-même and so forth, right? I mean, so there's still that language, even in the later work. And certainly in his discussion of virginity in Les Aveux, you have that kind of language as well, as a kind of self-emptying, right? And that leads to this larger question that I have about how we think about the trajectory of Foucault's thinking and this tendency to periodization and thinking about shifts and an evolution in his thought. Whereas I also think at the same time, there's a recursivity, right, that's in place in his thinking, but that could also characterize his own work. And that recursivity is very Nietzschean. And that, so when we talk about something like genealogy, we're talking not just about doing history differently, but we're also talking about a critique of morality in the Nietzschean sense, as a retraversal, right? As a going back, as a recursive retraversal of the land of morality, of the assumption of the subject of morality as a substance, as something that's given, and that is the foundation of moral action and moral thought. And I guess, so I could go on and on for hours about this, but I think you probably get the gist of my question. It has to do both with how we characterize the trajectory of Foucault's thought, but then I think that has implications for how we think about the problem of subjectivity in Foucault, whether or not there's a shift away from power, how we think about power. You know, power could just be pouvoir, to be able to, right, as a verb. Right, it's not necessarily a substance. So, you know, anyway, I think all of these things are related. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Yeah, it's a wonderful, I don't know if question or remark. I mean, I completely, agree and share what you just said. And perhaps one thing that I would add is that the way in which Foucault defines spirituality from 1979, the first time that he talks about this in relation to the Iranian uprising, to the end of his life, is precisely this idea of more related to the desubjectivation ethos of becoming other than one is. Spirituality for Foucault has not to do necessarily with religion, although religion can be a matrix for certain forms of spirituality, but spirituality conceptually for him really has to do with this idea of becoming other than one is. And I do think that genealogy is for Foucault a way to, when he writes genealogies, as he also says in some of his interviews, to becoming other than he was before writing those genealogies, and to offer the readers the possibility to becoming other than they were before reading his books. And in this, I completely agree with you. Genealogy is also always a critique of morality in a very Nietzschean fashion, and it's always also a critique of the self. There cannot be a genealogy in the Foucauldian sense without the questioning or the critiquing of the self that is in a way engaged in that form of genealogy. So as you said, a recursivity in his thinking, of course, it's not just about discontinuity, or it's about discontinuity, fractures and shifts, but discontinuity, fractures and shift that still Foucault constantly wants to make sense of and to narrate to us, like so many times Foucault wants to tell us what he's doing, what he was doing in the past in the light of what he was doing right now. Foucault is a wonderful genealogist of his own self and of his own intellectual career. So all of this, I don't see this as necessarily in contradiction. I think that you put it very well. It's an ethos that kind of characterizes Foucault throughout his life.
Beautiful. I think that the question of how do the periodization models tend to smuggle in a kind of evolutionary developmental narrative, because that's what we've come to kind of expect, versus how does the periodizing of Foucault help us to think through his own narrative as a genealogy, which is to say that kind of recursivity, which shows up insofar as there are these stages that we might delineate, but there are the continuities and the differences within these stages. And it's really that sense of what are the conditions of possibility for the next stage of thinking, not because it's an evolution, but because he's returning to the questions in different ways, in different frames. So I don't think that the periodizing move is necessarily teleological. And instead, I really like this kind of the recursive genealogizing of Foucault's own practices, which shows a lot about not only his own thought process, but as deeply embedded within a very particular time and place, wrestling with very particular political, social, and intellectual questions that I think it's really wonderful to see unfold here. So thank you for that. I'm going to, so Gina Sawicki would like to ask a question about desubjectivation and self-shattering. So maybe if you'd like to raise your hand. And before then, I'll take a question from Federico Testa, who can now talk.
Hi, thanks Danielle for the excellent talk. It's really nice, always really nice to listen to you explaining and guiding us through this details of Foucault's work. Now, I'm going to ask a question that sort of, that I deal with it in my own work, but I'm really curious to see what you think about it. Listening to you and your response to the last question, I would like to ask you about this sort of normative aspect of genealogy, right? I think we are in agreement that there is a normative aspect in genealogy. What I'm curious to hear from you is that it seems from your talk that you consider genealogy both to study critical attitudes, to examine them, to bring them to light, right? But also to somehow, you consider genealogy as a critical attitude, as a counter-conduct, as a critical ethos. In this sense, would you say that genealogy would have the source of this normativity would be internal to it, to the extent that genealogy is a critical gesture in itself, like the critical gestures it studies? Or would you say it comes from somewhere else? I mean, I sort of have an answer to that in my own way, but I'm really curious to see what you think about it.
Thank you so much, Federico. Nice to hear you. Yes, this is a crucial question. Thank you so much for this. So I would say that yes, what I try to do is precisely so to construe genealogy as a practice that is not just an intellectual one, because I think that it wasn't for Foucault, at least, but as a critical practice itself that, as Nikki was saying, is not prescriptive, of course, but is but does contain in itself a certain normativity or a normative force. So in the talk, I distinguish, that's a distinction that I borrow from Rael Yegi, between normativistic and normatively significant. Without wanting to go into that, I think that there's a normative significance of genealogy that I think stems from the fact that genealogy as practice by Foucault is itself a critical gesture. And so engaging with genealogy means engaging not with a simple descriptive narrative, but with a gesture that already positions itself within a certain organization and structure of power relations and resistances. The gesture of genealogy is never neutral. It's so when Foucault decides to write a genealogy of the prison, that's not a neutral gesture. Even if he doesn't tell us, oh, you have to go out there and abolish prisons. It's clear that he decides to write a genealogy of the prison because he wants to criticize the way in which the prison is shaped and works in our society. And so necessarily there is I would say at least a subjective normativity in the way in which genealogy positions itself in relation to other discourses. And there is, I think, a force, or there is an aim that genealogy has, not perhaps to convert their readers, but at least to push their readers to ask the same question that Foucault was asking himself when writing that kind of book. So the answer is yes, genealogy brings to life critical attitudes, but at the same time, it is, I think, an instance of the critical attitude itself. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Yana Sawiki?
Yes, yeah, thank you. This is very stimulating. I'd like to return again to desubjection or desubjectification, and the idea and genealogy together. So obviously, I mean, I'm assuming we can all think of the genealogical practice as another practice that is aiming toward desubjection, in the sense that for Foucault, yes, perhaps for the reader, an experience for the reader, it obviously not pointing in any particular prescriptive direction, because you could imagine really terrible things coming out of the influence of reading Foucault's genealogy, let alone the limited control you might have over something that was a good idea that did not transpire in the way that it was intended. So given that and the emphasis on struggle, I think it's a very, I think self-transformation, becoming otherwise, reorienting, seeing something very radically differently, undoing established habits and patterns. These are all what I associate with desubjection. I have some reservations, and I do see it as a tension with the, and of course in queer theory, there's more emphasis on the idea that of the more quasi-violent understanding of what self-shattering might be. And I wonder whether self-shattering seems like very much the wrong idea. And I'm not saying there may not be moments that Foucault seems to gesture in that direction, but he seems to be quite critical of self-renunciation, right? That is to say, a kind of renouncing of the self. Now, in the period of the fourth volume, and even before that, there's writing in which he's talking about the shift from the ancient Greco-Roman practices of the self to the early Christian ones. And the difference has to do somehow with this renunciation of the self, right? And I just don't, and that has a kind of moralistic dimension to it. The only reason I don't like self-shattering is because even though it's not moralistic in the same way, what it suggests is that I have a tainted self. And that seems very much a similar kind of move. That is, in other words, myself is in many ways been influenced by the time I'm in, and that is that has a lot of corrupt dimensions to it, or at least the particular things I'm looking at and how I look at those things. There's something wrong with those. I mean, if it's normative at all, or if there's any thrust to it, so to speak, then why self-renunciation? That strikes me as repeating a gesture that he has real reservations about. So.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting, and it helps me a lot to actually think through these questions that are still problematic for me as well. I kind of agree. I mean, I do agree with you on this, and probably, you know, the self-shattering is kind of a paroxystic kind of extreme, or define some paroxystic extreme moments when Foucault describes his experience of being hit by a car, you know, like almost dying, you know, like and kind of, you know, puts the experience of desubjectivation hand in hand with the experience of dying, and this goes back to things that.
Let me just interrupt. I think that's another drug-induced situation. I don't mean literally that he took drugs, but he was flooded with adrenaline at that moment, and probably cortisol, right? I mean, so yeah, I think that would be a good example. No wonder he felt high.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I can't speak out of my own experience on that, but I do agree with you that the notion of the renunciation of the self, on the contrary, I think that Foucault is explicitly aims to problematize and to be critical towards that notion. So perhaps instead of focusing on these extreme experiences of potential self-shattering, I do think that genealogy is not about self-shattering. It's about self-estrangement. It's about you know, like ways in which it is important in a way. How can I put that? Genealogy works in a way in which the point from which you start, which means the self, who you are before you start the genealogy process, in a way it provides the condition of possibility for the genealogy itself, because you know, it's so it's the idea that you're not just renouncing to yourself, or just saying, you know, like the self that you are right now is bad. You're trying to go through a process of, you know, questioning, of self-estrangement, of self-critiquing of yourself, but without, I think, any kind of moralistic idea that, you know, there is something wrong necessarily in the self that you are. I think that the idea is much more positive, that perhaps there are possibilities in yourself that you still are able to see, and that genealogy helps you.
That I think it makes sense and is helpful. The more extreme gestures, this is the last thing I'll say, could be maybe understood as you know, resistant practices of, I mean, when they're done by an act of terror, for example, or a self-immolation, or those are statements, right? And that's using yourself in a sense to make a statement, to a gesture, to resist. And, you know, when you're at that point, I suppose, you know, maybe you have a sense that there's limited options, but.
Absolutely. I mean,
yeah,
I think that Banu Bargu's book on self-immolation, and also the very short statement in Foucault's last lecture course on the courage of truth, in which he talks about terrorism and the person who puts a bomb on herself and you know, as a kind of practice that is délirante. I think that it's Foucault's word, like this kind of practice of truth, still a practice of truth, still a practice of resistance, but that it goes, like to the paroxysm. That's a very complicated question. I think I can't really go into details in this brief time, but it's a fascinating question. And for sure, I think that genealogy, as Foucault practices it, doesn't have to do with that kind of extreme practices, but more with what I was describing before.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
If I can just say briefly, the self-relation that Foucault describes in 1982, for example, where in the Greeks and then the Romans in particular in 1982 is a relation of self to self in a way that enables that kind of paroxystic logic, especially of pleasure for the ancient Greeks, to like exceed oneself, not shatter as such. And so it's not that renunciation. Whereas the contrast with Cashin then in 1982 is that Cashin is the person who kind of inaugurates this interiorizing of self. And this is where sex becomes discourse about sex, but also where you confess the truth about yourself in order to renounce that self. And that's where it seems like the dynamics of self-renunciation become more pernicious, because those are the mechanisms that then get taken up by the confessional and end up impacting modern regimes as well. So I think that the self-relation within the Greeks and the Romans allows for an active relation of self to self, even if it's a self that attains to or has a relation to a truth that is more than one. Whereas the self-renunciation model that he finds in Cashin, for example, is one that sees the truth in order to negate it. Yeah. Importantly, though, there's a midpoint between those two, which is Gregory of Nyssa in 1982, where he sees Nyssa as the bookend in an 800-year period from Socrates, where you have care of the self, the epimeleia, how to, as an act of self-relation, which is how we get back to virginity. So there are these three different moments that are important to differentiate, but I think they also give a good sense of where Foucault is trying to balance these narratives according to those two trajectories that you said at the beginning. And that kind of weird third missing middle way is the most obscure, but perhaps the one that is the most critical to take up.
Absolutely. And if I could just add about Cashin, I think that the model of self-renunciation that Foucault kind of tries to trace to Cashin and then to what comes after him is a model that has to do with the affirmation, the constant affirmation of yourself as a sinner in order to be able to renounce to yourself. So it's not really renouncing to yourself, is submitting yourself constantly to the power of another, saying, I am a sinner. I will always be, like someone that has to renounce to myself. And so it's very paradoxical. Whereas when Foucault talks about metanoia before Cashin, probably, and the experience of conversion, I think that there is a way in which the renunciation of self in conversion can really give us access to something that is different. Whereas the renunciation of the self in Cashin is, I renounce to myself in order to affirm tomorrow the same thing about myself. I am a sinner, so I have to renounce. And then, the day after, etc. And you're trapped in a way in this cycle.
Which goes to 1984, where metanoia and the way in which this conversion to l'autre vie, the other life, is then present in the Cynics in a way that Foucault thinks is really illustrative of parousia as critique and word and deed. And that he thinks that even some of the Christians would then radicalize. So it's a really strange set of dynamics. I know that we've kept you for so long.
It's okay.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Excellent. So we have some more questions. I mean, if people actually want to keep going, or we can maybe take one or two more if you're up for.
Sure. I don't want to keep you though. I mean, so
What am I going to be doing? Just 5 other conferences. Oh, please, Jim. Oh, you're still muted.
Boom. No, I was just waving at you. I was just waving at you, acknowledging your vigor. I have a huge question, typical, but I'm going to, which Daniele, your talk in particular is clarified for me as in clarifying the butters that we've already had in so many of the precedent talks about the relationship between paresia and truth and critique. So I'm going to warn all of you who are listening in advance that that's going to be my obnoxious intervention into this process. I'll just very briefly say that one of the things that I'm most worried about in Foucault's appropriation of the concept of paresia from the classical texts, let us point out pagan texts, is that he slides into reading the concept in its ancient meaning as speaking frankly into speaking the truth. And what he means by the truth seems to me to float very, very unclearly through his engagement with the concept. And as opposed to, not as opposed to savoir, because we already know what he meant by that, right? In the early works in the archaeology of knowledge, but as opposed to something like connaissance, its relationship to experience, finally experience returns after so many decades of its having vanished. One of the problems that I have raised in a couple of totally forgettable publications is that in the slide between the meaning of paresia as speaking frankly, speaking fully, right, is what it actually means. Running your mouth off is what it actually means, uninhibitedly. To the truth, a concept that, again, he really does not specify for us clearly. I mean, he said at one point, I love it. I'm not an analytical philosopher, nobody's perfect. Yeah, but okay, we might be able to use a little bit of an analytical philosopher here at this point to understand what he means by the concept in contrast to savoir or even connaissance. But the result of which is that, if we're going to just understand paresia as speaking truth to power, which it has so often been construed, then we're going to have to recognize that Holocaust deniers think of themselves as speaking truth to power, right? And okay, it's critique, but are we, all of us good people, thinking about the practice of critique, a practice of critique that would embrace those people as much as we embrace ourselves, obviously, of a very different cast? I think, Daniele, you're underscoring that the practice of critique as paresia has to always be self-reflective and a manner of critique of self as much as it is a critique of the powerful surrounds, the governmental powers that be. I think that's a really, really crucial insight that should be taken much further, but as we all know, the construal of Foucault as a neocon or a whatever, or a libertarian, or a kind of radical individualist, is not entirely without substance, precisely because nothing beyond the very, very beautiful but brief articulation of a notion of modern philosophical ethos of critique in what is Enlightenment has been left to us. So this seems to me to be an enormous locus of work in all of us who know very well what he had in mind, which was not supporting Holocaust deniers, of course, but something that is deeply undeveloped. But anyway, thank you, Danielle, for giving me the clarity in what's going to have to speak in what is going to have to be about 15 minutes for coalescing a kind of iconic topic, that of critique, that I really just had flooding in my head previously.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Beautiful talk, by the way. Beautiful, beautiful talk. And you know, I was so happy to find myself having agreed with you in so many respects, and I was only unhappy when I discovered that you showed me I was wrong. But I'm not gonna visit that.
No, I mean it's. Thank you, and of course this is a, you know, every time that I was presenting between, you know, in the past 4 years on parousia, especially in the United States, the question was, well, Trump is a parousiast, right? So how does Foucault respond to this question, right?
Yeah, right.
Now Trump is no longer there, so perhaps, you know, like that question I will get it less, but I think it's a totally, I mean, I think it's a very important concern. What I would say, just very briefly, because it's a huge topic, on the slide between speaking frankly and speaking the truth, I think that really the origin, I mean, if we want to make sense of what Foucault is saying there, I think we really have to look at du gouvernement des vivants and his notion of a lethargy, and his notion of the manifestation of the truth as something that is not necessarily connaissance, you know, like, but that is just another way of saying, you know, governing people entails operations in the order of, you know, statements that will be considered as true and false.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I really wanted to hear what you were saying.
Sorry.
My internet just, I mean, my connection to you just crashed. Could you maybe like reel back?
Yes. So I wanted to say that I think that what Foucault is doing in Du gouvernement des vivants is really offering us the keys to understanding what it means, you know, being governed through the manifestation of the truth, which has nothing to do with our notion of truth, with the epistemological notion of truth or logical notion of truth or connaissance, which is what in Le Pouvoir Psychiatrique I think it defines as truth event, which is just the idea that in processes of governing human beings, strangely or not, we engage in you know, ways of differentiating what we call truth and what we call falsehood, you know, like, and without wanting to stipulate on that or to saying that the parousiast is the one who says the truth as the objective truth, right? It's about the idea, I think, that parousia, as he says, is not a mental experience, it is a practice. And as you were saying, it is a practice that has also something to do with the critique of oneself. He says that at the beginning of of his lectures at Berkeley in 1983, most, I think, explicitly. So you're totally right that there's a problem there. We have to figure out what he means by telling the truth, but I think that it's not an unsurmountable problem, that we can go back to Du Gouvernement des Vivants and make sense of what he means there. And I agree with you that if we just take parousia in Foucault, meaning speaking truth to power, so it's always positive. I mean, it's a very anti-Foucauldian way of taking things. For Foucault, nothing is purely good or purely bad. You know, like,
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
so.
Thumbs
So
up.
I think that there is a problem in the way in which this notion has been, taken on in the past 10 years after the publication of the last two lecture courses in Foucault, just by saying, well, Foucault was just making the apology of the parasiast, whereas we see in those courses that that's not what Foucault is interested in. I think that he was interested in doing a genealogy of the critical attitude where parousia can play many different roles. But I'm very curious and I look forward to your reflections on this.
Well, I mean, the other thing that are we still on?
We are.
So I'm just, the other thing is that, the great famous icon of the parasiast in Christian scholarship is Jesus. And I mean, that's the term that is one of the great iconic epithets applied to him. And it's also fascinating to me that Foucault just really, I'm sure he knew, but never, so far as I know, unless you people with your boxes, because you lucky people with all of your boxes and your archives may have visited it, it doesn't appear in any of the published works. And it's a very curious omission. I think omission. He surely knew.
He might briefly refer to that, not like more in terms of the true life that he talks about when he talks about the cynics, like but yeah, it's true that I don't know if Nikki has seen anything in the archives. I don't recall anything on this.
Yeah, there's a letter, une lettre d'une auditrice, so an auditor of his course who writes him a letter that describes the different folds of parousia within these early Christian figures.
Oh, yeah.
It's fascinating. I mean, the letter is in the archives, and she starts off with Abba Cassian. So she's citing from the Apothegmata, Patron, the sayings of the Desert Fathers and others, but she starts with Cassian and then goes into these other examples. And Foucault describes this in one of his following lectures. But it's a very interesting thing, the examples that he chooses to incorporate and those that he chooses to not, because Cassian, for example, needs to be his fulcrum for the way in which we end up with certain conditions of modern disciplinary subjectivity, which is, I think, why he can't countenance the idea that Alba Cassian can also be a parasiast, even though it's literally within the Greek text. And he had it because there's this letter from the auditor. So I think there are examples like that. In Recollection, he does refer to Jesus a couple times within this fold, but it's like that question with Paul that Richard Stryer has been asking about. It's like, why not these earliest movements of Christ followers, et cetera. And this is one of those big questions that we'll continue to work out. Super fascinating. This is just a follow-up, and then we'll let you rest. All right. I know that it's a cocktail hour where you are. So this is from Randall Johnson, who says, wonderful talk. It seems like allithurgy in the lectures on the government of the living exhibits an adequate degree of rationality to be discursively intelligible, while remaining quite distinct from anything that could be named reason in general. If this seems accurate, I'm curious how you would characterize allithurgy as exceeding reason, or as in some ways perhaps as unreasonable.
Okay. Yes. So after 1 hour 45 minutes? That's the right question that I want to know. It's a wonderful question. It's really a wonderful question, and this plays in, I think, something else that is going on in Du Gouvernement des Vivants, especially in the lecture of the 6th of February, when Foucault redefines what games and regimes of truth are for him, in a way that I do believe is probably the best. I mean, I came to be convinced that that's probably the best place to refute the accusation of Foucault as a relativist that we can find. The division, the distinction that he makes between games and regimes of truth. So that's a completely other question. But that was to say, because I do think that there is a degree of reason or of rationality in a lethargy, in the ways in which Foucault characterizes games and regimes of truth. Of course there is, but at the same time, by the same gesture, I think that Foucault also wants to show us that the ways in which we interpret what reason and rationality is itself a part of a certain regime of truth. So in a way, we are never outside. I mean, rationality is never, like something that we can kind of reach outside of this play and interplay between games and regimes of truth. And of course, so what about the unreason or the unreasonable? I mean, we should go back to the history of madness here, in a way, like in this partage between reason and unreason. But once again, and I think that that's very interesting, Foucault refers to this in Du Gouvernement des Vivants. When he talks about regimes of truth, he takes on again the example of Descartes for madness, in order to show that that's the moment, like this split between reason and unreason that was made at that point, not necessarily by Descartes, but let's say during that time, was itself part of a certain way of creating a partage within a regime of truth that was not the same as before. So how do we talk about a lethargy as unreasonable? I think that it all depends on what kind of regime of truth we are. Like if we are in our regime of truth and we have a certain definition of what reason and unreason are, we are forced in a way, according to Foucault, to talk using those notions. But I think that one of the things that Foucault wanted to do was precisely to unpack or to contest the ways in which we come to think of reason and unreason. And so therefore, does in a lethargy, an unreasonable lethargy, is that possible? For us, it seems that it's impossible, but it was perhaps possible in a different regime of truth. And perhaps one of our political tasks is to make these experiences possible again, and not to, and to contest, for instance, this partage between reason and unreason. So once again, telling the truth for us must be reasonable and rational, but perhaps Foucault helps us see that that is not necessary, and that we can try to contest and to resist to this notion as well.
Beautiful. Daniele, thank you so much. This has been an exquisite couple of hours. Thank you all for your questions. They were really
Thank you.
today. Jim, and
thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Daniele. Beautiful, and just another exquisite gem in the necklace we're producing here. I keep, rainbows and pots of gold, necklaces and diamonds, whatever, but they're all appropriate. Lovely to see you. Hope we cross paths again face to face at some point, Danielle.
Yes, looking forward to that. And thank you so much, Jim, Nikki, and everyone.
Thank you so much.